Good afternoon, or good morning. With classes being online now, it's hard to say what time you're watching this, so I'd like to wish you a good of both. My name is Lily, and I'm majoring in criminal justice. For me, studying criminal justice did not start in college, it actually started in high school. My junior year, I took a forensic science class, but then my senior year, I took a police service aid course. In this course, I basically got to meet a whole bunch of different officers almost every week. I got to talk to a lot of different officers and I got to ask them a lot of questions. And one of the biggest things that all of them said was that there needs to be a better solution for mental health involving the criminal justice system. Now, I know that last time I talked to you, I discussed mental health and the criminal justice system, but this time I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into the big subject instead of just individual branch. So let's see. Last time I discussed the criminal justice system, and I talked about the three branches: the corrections facilities, the law enforcement, and the courts. We learned from more than just a number. We learned that correction facilities need to have counseling that is tailored to each individual instead of overgeneralized counseling techniques. The courts created a separate court called mental health court, which was able to divert people from prison and help them find treatment instead of prison. Law enforcement created a crisis intervention team, which is a team of officers who received extra training to be more prepared to deal with someone with a mental illness. While each branch has its own individual problem, there is one big problem that rests upon the entire surface. Before I move forward with this, real quick, I need to ask you a question. Have you ever read One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest? I don't know. But it's a story about a criminal who pretends to be crazy so he can finish out his prison term in a nice, easy mental institution. Only after he arrives, he realizes that the hospital is far more corrupt than the actual prison that he started in. In the past, mental institutions were terrible environments that mostly focused on keeping people inside rather than helping them. Around the 1950s, there was a big movement across America that worked to deinstitutionalize mental hospitals. That came with many positives, but it also brought out some problems. I have here a quote from Short on an article about New York and the prison system after this movement. I will put this on my presentation aid. The deinstitutionalization movement failed to shield individuals with mental health needs from the criminal justice system because it did not create the type of robust treatment model shown to prevent arrest and incarceration. So what this quote is basically saying is that the reason the deinstitutionalization movement failed is because when they shut down the hospitals, they didn't create other places for people to go to get help. And what ended up happening was a lot of these people that had been released, instead of getting help, got arrested and ended up in prison. Because after the mental institutions were closed, many people had nowhere to go. Last time I talked to you, I also talked about the stigma people have against mental illness. Studies have found that stigmatizing attitudes toward people living with mental illness are widespread both within Western and Chinese communities. This is a quote from an article written by Ho. With the increase of incarcerations with mental illness and the combination of society's stigma, there was bound to be an issue. When you have a whole bunch of people that have a mental illness come out on the streets and you have a society that doesn't see it as a normal thing or sees it as bad, usually what happens is the police get called. The biggest stress on the criminal justice system and the mental health community is the lack of resources for mental illness. Between 14 and 24% of Hong Kong's population has a mental illness, and only 1% of that group receives help. This is a statistic from Ho's article again. There needs to be more resources for mental illness. The mental institutions of the past were terrible environments, but prison has become, in a way, a new form of mental institutions, and that needs to stop. We need to create more resources for mental health facilities to help lighten the load on the CJ system, and there is a way for us to do this. After the deinstitutionalization of mental hospitals, there were many programs created and designed to help create a way for people to get resources that they needed. However, many of these programs were not actually complete and fulfilled. They were only planned. The first step to easing the pressure off of the criminal justice system is to fully implement the original planned resources for the mental health community. Now, I know there are problems with this. Two of the biggest ones I can think of is, where are we going to get the funding? And isn't opening more mental health care facilities possibly putting people back into the corrupt hands that we took them out of? And these are both really good points. Funding has always been a big question for any program. The resources for these programs were originally defunded by President Nixon. After more cuts were made by Congress, the responsibility was handed from federal power over to state governments in the 90s. So if we start pushing for federal legislation to support mental health communities and resources, we could start creating change and start getting more help statewide. We could open donation opportunities so that people could give their money to these areas that need it and create more facilities. And we could also move funding from prisons towards mental health facilities. Now, we have the point that mental institutions were shut down for a reason. How do we know that that won't happen again? And I have to be honest, we don't know for sure. We can't say what the future is going to hold. But I believe that facilities would be in the public eye and would be held to a higher standard. The facilities would be aimed at a volunteer treatment plan instead of a forceful and kind of enslaving treatment of the past. Opening more mental health facilities would also help strengthen mental health courts or create other options for the CJ system, which CONDRAT admits a need for in analysis of readmission to a mental health court. With new programs, we can work with interagency communication between law enforcement officers and mental health clinics, like the one described in an article I read. In this model, if an officer receives a call that involves a mental health agency or a mental health person, what happens is a member from a crisis intervention team and a member from a mental health clinic both go to the scene together, and they both work together with the individual to help them find proper care that is needed instead of them just being taken to prison. And this could be a program that could be started, which could add a lot of help. So we're here at the end. We reviewed the 3 branches of the criminal justice system. We also looked at what the main cause of these problems were, which was when the mental institutions were closed down, there was nowhere for people to go. And so what happened was a lot of them got arrested. We talked about how many of the planned resources didn't get fulfilled because of the cut of funding. And then we talked about solutions. The first solution was to start a movement to push federal legislature in favor of mental health resources. And we could create funding by moving money from prisons to mental health facilities and accept donations. In the past, mental hospitals were a problem and not a solution. If they focus on treatment instead of coercion, we may be able to create safe places for someone with mental illness to go instead of prison. Prisons can't focus on providing care. That's not what they're for. Instead of sending people on a downward path, let's give them the resources they need to make their life